Welcome to Sheean Walk. There's a lot to be said about Teddy, and we'll have more of that along the way. But if you want a crash course in Australian military history, this walk will do it. Nice level path, ideal for wheelchairs if you can get through the chicanes, which I think you should have no trouble doing. Lined with native trees and very talkative birds. Now up further we begin a series of plinths with aspects of Australian military history. The sad thing is there's plenty of room for expansion. These are grouped into post-World War II, World War I, and then World War II, which is where Teddy Sheean came in. And we'll have more on him at the end of the walk, where there's a plinth and a statue and whatnot. Tiny little native flowers along the way, and somewhat fittingly some dandelions as well. A very popular bottle brush. Nice head-on shot there. This one's a very tiny one. This one's a variation on the theme. And you can see the first of the memorial markers up there in concrete. So the latest plinth we have is Vietnam. We haven't got East Timor, Iran or Iraq, or not Iran, Afghanistan or Iraq up yet, but that will come, I imagine. So some 50,000 Australians served, 504 were killed and 2,400 wounded, 4 VCs awarded. And this is where Australia continued their tradition of jungle warfare in Sarawak and the Malay Peninsula during what I think the English called, or the British called, the Malayan Emergency, where an insurgency, communist insurgency, was actually defeated. And of course, prior to that was the police action by the United Nations in Korea, where basically a First World War battles occurred using Second World War weaponry, which is never pleasant. 339 Australians lost, about 1,500 casualties. My error about the emergency before. This is the original emergency, 48 to 60. Some 10,000 Australians served in Malaya. No record there of any losses. It continues. Some timber gating here in an attempt to stop push bike riders. I passed one earlier, it's not working. Through the guts of suburbia. Really thickly studded memorials, and we'll cover those as we go past. It's the action at the end of the First World War, where the Australians, Canadians and Scots basically broke through the Hindenburg Line, which was Germany's last defence, and towards the end of the 100-day campaign, which brought German resistance to an end. So many battles of the Somme. On the night of the 31st of August, 2 Div AIF crossed the Somme and attacked the Germans. By morning, the troops had gained the slopes and summit of a village of Mont Saint-Quentin. After Germans regrouped and counter-attacked, suffering heavy losses, the Australians forced them back. However, reinforcements from relief battalions, all areas were retaken. And on the 3rd, the AIF forced a complete withdrawal of German forces. Battles of the Somme where we were winning and not just throwing away lives. Battle of Hamel was designed by Monash and basically used all arms to prevent loss of casualties. At the Battle of Hamel, the Americans joined the Australians here for a combined arms attack. Tanks, artillery, infantry and aircraft. It took 90 minutes, minimal casualties, and all objectives were reached. Showed what could be done with some thought. Yeah, Villiers Britain, They still hold commemorations there on Anzac Day for the Australian troops that saved their village. It was a nasty thing, not fully designed by Monash like Hamill, and did lead to a lot of casualties, but the town was retaken and the Germans thrown back. Perhaps the last successful cavalry charge in history, the Battle of Beersheba, subtitled here, Charge of the Light Brigade. The Light Horse Brigades, the 4th and 12th, took Beersheba, a heavily fortified town, and more particularly its wells. 2 attacks had failed to take Gaza frontally, and so by outflanking the Turkish line around Beersheba, the right end of the Turkish defensive line was taken. 40,000 Horsemen is a classic film if you want to see an Australian film version of what happened. Passchendaele, you can Google that if you want to know about that. None of it went well. It was a particularly nasty day. Australia suffered 38,000 casualties from the 5 battles over an 8-week period. And Road, another one of those heavy casualty events, 5,013, the AIF. The Battle of Polygon Wood's interesting. So consolidating the men in Road Ridge, 4th and 5th Divisions advanced to Polygon Wood to relieve the 1st and 2nd Divisions. To the south, the 15th Brigade reinforced, hit its objectives, and then those allocated to the 98th British Brigade. 5,770 Australian casualties. The AIF covering for other nations was not unusual in the First World War. 3rd Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele offensive, none of it was good. None of it was well designed, just drove people forward. Now this is one not many people know about, the Battle of Romani. The Anzac Mounted Division, 1st, 2nd and 3rd Light Horse Brigades and the New Zealand Mounted Rifles in March 1916, so after the Gallipoli hoo-ha. So they held the defence outnumbered and then managed to hold the thing overnight and then pursue the Turks further north, which led eventually to the Battle of Beersheba we covered earlier. This is definitely that period of the war where there was no manoeuvre and not much thought given other than just throwing people forward, hoping that Elan would work. But it never happened. So it happened, but with huge casualties. 5,285 on the 27th of July 1916. Germans were thrown back, but not far, and basically it was a stalemate from middle of 1915 through to the middle of 1917. Battle of Fromelles, first major action by Australian troops on the Western Front, designed as a diversion. Preliminary bombardment eliminated the element of surprise, and the 5th Division AIF suffered heavily from German machine gun fire especially. The 8th and 14th Brigades captured small parts of the German trenches but were unable to maintain their hold. The battle was a complete failure, having no impact on the Somme offensive, but did cost 5,533 casualties. Now this was a needs-must event at the Neck. This is up on the Dardanelles, where the Australians and New Zealanders made their name. So they dismounted the 8th and 10th Light Horse Brigades, made them fight as infantry, and from 4:30 a.m. on the 7th of August, 4 waves of 150 men at 2-minute intervals went forward. The bombardment ceased early, Turks were ready, and each wave was cut down a few paces from their trench. In 7 minutes, 375 were dead or wounded, and they gained no ground. You can see why we're a bit dirty on the English. Now, lone pine is a big thing in Australian history. There's a lot of seeds taken from that tree. There's one in Ulverston, there's one at the old cemetery in Penguin. Again, another diversionary attack. Led to hand-to-hand combat with the Turks. By 6 p.m. the Turkish lines had been taken and the Lone Pine area was defended, but at huge cost. 7 VCs awarded on the day. And the Lone Pine Memorial at Gallipoli commemorates the 3,268 Australian and 456 Kiwis who have no known grave. The 960 Australian and I believe that's 202 Kiwis buried at sea after evacuation who died of wounds and disease. Okay, so we arrived on the 25th of April and by the 18th of May 42,000 Turkish troops were assembled to push the bridgehead into the sea. There are only 12,500 Australian Anzacs there. So the Turks lost some 10,000 and the Australians lost 160 and 468 wounded, which shows you the pointlessness of frontal assaults against in-place troops. People didn't seem to learn on the Western Front until late 1917, early 1918. So then on the 24th of May, 6 days later, a truce was arranged so that the dead could be buried. There were so many of them. Another pointless exercise, Cape Helles, it's in the Dardanelles there. On the 10th of May, they attacked towards Crutha in an hour and 1,000 yards. 1,056 men were killed, wounded or missing and achieved nothing. This whole thing was conceived by Churchill, by the way. Now Gallipoli and the Dardanelles, that's the Hellespont, or the gap between Asia and Europe. Now on the morning of the 25th, the Royal Australian Navy submarine AE2 penetrated the Narrows. Her task was to get through the Dardanelles and run amok, which she did for 5 days. She sunk by a Turkish cruiser and with all her torpedoes expended on the 30th, she was scuttled and the crew became POWs. She sunk a Turkish cruiser and with all her torpedoes expended by the 30th of April, she was scuttled and the crew became POWs. Yeah, this was the first day at Gallipoli. 4 a.m. The 3rd Brigade followed closely by 3rd Division followed closely by the 1st, 2nd and 4th Divs started to row to the beaches at Aribur. Their instructions were clear: keep going at all costs. Landed under heavy fire and by evening 16,000 men were aboard. Well, on land anyway. 16,000 men had been landed in the beachhead. Considering what was coming, the 2,000 killed or wounded in a day was not too bad, but it must have been a shock to those that had never seen action before. Here's a bigger version of the bottle brush in a scarlet red. So, 500,000 troops were put onto Gallipoli, and the campaign lasted 9 months, 25th of April to the 6th of January. 33,532 killed, 78,518 wounded, and 7,689 missing. Australians lost 8,709 killed and 19,441 wounded, and 9 VCs. And indeed, the Anzac legend was born. In those tumultuous 4 years, 14 to 18, technology changed enormously. And the Australian Flying Corps was created. They flew in Egypt, Palestine and Syria, and some also flew on the Western Front. The HMAS Sydney took part in a battle off the Cocos-Keeling group of islands, where the cruiser Sydney engaged the German light cruiser SMS Emden, as the latter was attempting to destroy communication links. The battle on the 9th of November, so not far into the show, resulted in the crippling of the German cruiser, which was driven ashore by her captain. Australian casualties were 4 men killed, 12 wounded, and the Emden lost 134 dead and 65 wounded. And thus began the proud tradition of the HMAS Sydneys. Yes, not many people know about this. This was one of the first actions of the Great War, Australian military and expeditionary force, naval and military expeditionary force, 1,000 strong infantry and 500 naval reservists, destroy the German wireless stations in the southwest Pacific and occupy German New Guinea, which they did, meeting resistance, but with the support of reinforcements. The ANMEF captured the radio station by 7 p.m. 6 Australians were killed or died of wounds and another 4 were wounded. Rabaul of all places. And our path continues on here, but that walk there is the Kings Park walk. I'll put a link to that at the end of the video. We're now entering the Second World War section of the walk. And there's some interesting stuff there that a lot of people overseas might not know about, or even some of the locals too. With the beginning of total war from the First World War on, the home front became just as important in a lot of ways. If you can't feed people, they can't fight. So the Australian women and the men of the home front, so reserved occupations like mining and farming and whatnot, and the women, 190,000 women were in the direct war work, filled jobs across the spectrum held by men before the war. And the Women's Land Army was formed and made a significant contribution to Australia's rural labour supply. First World War had basically been fought elsewhere. Second World War was the first time we came under attack, which was the 19th of February 1942. 64 raids against the Darwin area and its airfields, all the way around to Broome and Wyndham and Derby, were bombed as well on the west coast, and down as far south as Townsville on the east coast. Landmines were laid, German and Japanese submarines operated in Australian waters, and there was a Japanese mini-sub attack in Sydney Harbour. Clearly none of these were the same as the people in Europe and Asia who were occupied and had their lands fought over, but it did bring it home to people. This was quite horrific for a lot of people. Some 8,712, including 26 Navy, 7,055 Army and 1,459 Air Force were captured in Europe and the Middle East. And they suffered under the Germans and Italians, but the 22,400 captured by the Japanese in Singapore and Java, Timor and New Britain was subjected to horrific treatment, with only 14,500 surviving. Just horrific. One of the last of the island hopping operations in May 1945, 26th Brigade and 9 Div established an air and naval facilities and overcame stiff Japanese resistance on Borneo. A couple of months later, and the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As we go along here, seems to be in reverse date order again. We're getting closer to Australia, from Borneo down to Bougainville, where we took over from the US forces in November-December 44, captured Pearl Ridge. By the end of December, in the central sector, the Australian positions were established, and they defeated the Japanese in the south. In the north, the advance began in 45, resulting in the enemy being cleared from the peninsula in March, with a VC to Private Frank Partridge. Battle of Leyte Gulf, October the 20th, 1944. US forces returned to Philippines, and 8 RAN vessels, including Australia and Shropshire, took part in the battle, which crippled the main enemy fleet, that is the Japanese fleet. The RAF played a part, preventing enemy air reinforcements, and Australia suffered 5 kamikaze attacks. Shropshire, Hobart, Bataan and Warramunga shared in the Japanese surrender a year later. And New Britain and Wewak in places. The Australian 5th Division and 6th Division did their work, and another VC awarded to Private E. Kenner. And on the other side of the world, when D-Day was happening, it was about 2,600 Australian servicemen took part. People attacked officers and ratings attached to the Royal Navy. Army officers served as observers, and the RAAF had 10 squadrons as well as 1,500 aircrew in the RAF squadrons. Now, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was important because the Japanese held way on the northern shore of New Guinea, and this battle, in which the US Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force destroyed an enemy convoy attempting to reinforce Lae, it was important to cut off their supply. And of course, there was a VC awarded Flight Lieutenant William Newton, and it was awarded posthumously, unfortunately. Now, this is the thing not many overseas people know about, and not enough Australians do. The Battle of Milne Bay, the 25th of August to the 6th of September 1942. Australian forces were the first ever to turn back the Japanese and to defeat them in battle. It was just before the Battle of the Coral Sea, so bad luck, Yanks, you miss out. The one we all know about. Force of 13,500 Japanese pushed the AAF back almost all the way to Port Moresby before counter-attacking. Imata Ridge was where they were finally stopped, and Kokoda was recaptured in November 1942. 4 AIF brigades took part, 605 deceased and 1,015 wounded, and a VC for Private Bruce Kingsbury, another one posthumous. This was the sad part. Japanese invaded Malaya, as it was called then, on the 8th of December 1941, day after Pearl Harbor, which was actually Pearl Harbor Day here. 8th Division AIF was held in reserve. When most of Malaya was already lost, they were thrown in. They fought a retreating battle back to Singapore, which was captured in February the 15th. Australia's lost 1,789 killed, 13 and 6 wounded, and 15,384 prisoners. The VC was given to Lieutenant Colonel C.G.W. Anderson. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, in the Western Desert, where the Allied forces were attempting to protect Egypt, the Suez Canal and the oil reserves, the Battle of El Alamein was fought under General Montgomery, who spent time in Tasmania as a young fella. Okay, the greatest Allied success to date in World War II. 9th Division shared the honours in this tremendous battle, at one stage taking the main brunt of the fighting, losing 620 dead. 3 VCs were awarded, all posthumous: Privates Gurney and Gatwick and Sergeant Kibbe. Yes, in Syria, which was a French protectorate after the First World War, the idea was to knock the Vichy out so that the route to India and the supply lines for the empire as it was then could be protected. And with the capture of Damascus, Palestine was secured for the Allies. An important strategic campaign of 6 weeks. And a VC for Lieutenant Roden Cutler, who went on to become Governor of New South Wales. Sparrow Force on Timor in 41, 2 and 3. They were members of the 2nd 40th Battalion. Anti-tank, anti-aircraft gunners and signallers landed in Dutch Timor after the Japanese invasion. They were hidden by a lot of the locals who suffered under Japanese oppression, especially in East Timor, or Portuguese Timor as it was then. But the 300 men managed to immobilise 30,000 enemy until help arrived in 45. Another great decision by our mate Churchill. So when Germany attacked Yugoslavia and Greece, 50,000 Allied troops, including the 6th Div AIF, 2nd AIF, had to evacuate to Crete because Greece was already lost by then. And we lost, in Australia, and the AIF lost 320 killed, 494 wounded and 2,030 captured. German forces eventually outnumbered everyone, and Crete fell as well. Now then, Tobruk was the only deep water harbour between far West Africa and Cairo and Egypt. So the Africa Corps needed to take it. However, it was held and kept open. The Germans attempted to use propaganda referring to the men trapped there as the rats of Tobruk, who then took it as a badge of honour. Did my recruit training at Bardia Barracks. So the 2nd AIF, raised in September 39, left for the Middle East in January and captured the Italian-held Bardia in 1941 with 40,000 prisoners and much equipment. Yeah. And then they took Tobruk not long after, January 21-22, taking another 25,000 prisoners. The victories were a great morale boost for the Allies at the time, but did lead to Rommel wandering over to become charge of the Africa Corps, and things got a lot more serious. Lest we forget, indeed. Crossing over a bridge, that waterway is linked to the one we crossed when we were in Kings Park. Again, I'll have that link at the end of the video. And we're coming to the end of the walk now. More bottle brush on the left, quite attractive, light pink version. Around the bend is the Teddy Sheean monument. It's him with his back to us as he faces into the street. And there's the monument to Teddy Sheean VC. And what we've just been along is the Sheean Walk. Collins class submarine named after the young fella who received his VC much later than he should have. There's moments in the life of Teddy Sheean, and this is how it ended.